A 7-year-old girl stood alone in the dark outside Seoul's most dangerous restaurant, holding a crumpled $5 bill. And she wasn't begging. She was trying to hire the most feared crime boss in Korea. Her mother had been kidnapped. The police laughed in her face, and the only person she believed could bring her mother home was a man who had never shown mercy to anyone in his life. What happens next will break you and rebuild you at the same time. Stay until the very end, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The restaurant had no sign above the door. That was the first thing people noticed. Or rather, the first thing they noticed when they stopped and thought about it later, usually after they'd already walked past it 3 times looking for the entrance. No name, no neon, no chalkboard listing tonight's specials. Just a heavy black lacquered door set flush into a stone facade on a narrow side street off Cheongdam-dong, with 2 men standing outside who didn't look like doormen, but whose stillness had the particular quality of loaded weapons resting on a table. The street itself smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. That particular pressure in the air that Seoul gets in late October, when the sky goes the color of old pewter, and the temperature drops fast enough that your breath starts to show, but you haven't quite admitted to yourself that summer is gone. The ginkgo trees lining the main boulevard 2 blocks over had already turned, that violent, almost offensive yellow, but on this side street there were no trees, just stone and light, and 2 men who weren't doormen watching a black Mercedes S-Class ease to a stop against the curb. The driver killed the engine. Nobody moved. The 2 men who weren't doormen didn't look at the car. They looked at the street. They looked at the rooftops. They looked at the mouth of the alley 30 meters to the left, and at the couple walking their dog on the far sidewalk, and at the delivery scooter that had parked at the corner 4 minutes ago. They cataloged everything with the flat efficiency of people who had been trained to understand that the thing that kills you is never the thing you're looking at. The driver's door opened first. Park Sung-ho stepped out and came around to the rear passenger door with the practiced neutrality of a man who had been doing this for 11 years, and he was halfway to reaching for the handle when the door opened from the inside. Kang Tae-jin didn't wait to be helped out of cars. He never had. It was one of the small, consistent ways he maintained the distinction between respect and dependency. He would accept the first. He had no patience for the second. He stepped out onto the wet pavement in a charcoal suit that had been cut for him by a tailor in Apgujeong, who charged more for a jacket than most of his restaurant's kitchen staff earned in 2 months. And he straightened his cuffs with 2 quick, precise movements, and he looked up at the sky. He was 41 years old. He had a face that had been handsome once and was now something harder and more specific than handsome. The kind of face that accrued authority the way stone accrues weathering, each line and shadow adding to a total impression of someone who had survived things that would have rearranged other people entirely. His hair was black going silver at the temples. His jaw was tight. He had a scar along the left side of his neck, thin as a thread, that disappeared into his collar, and he had learned to wear that collar buttoned high enough that only people who already knew about it would think to look. He stood there for exactly 2 seconds, taking in the street. He was not a man who stood outside in the cold for longer than he needed to. He had meetings scheduled, and he was already 4 minutes late for the first of them, and he did not like being late because lateness was a message, and the message it sent was never the one you intended. He was turning toward the door when he heard the sound. It was small, a scrape. The kind of sound a shoe makes on wet pavement when the person wearing it is trying very hard not to make any sound at all. He stopped. Sung-ho had already moved, 2 steps toward the sound, hand inside his jacket. The 2 men by the door had shifted their weight without appearing to have moved at all. Everyone was looking at the narrow gap between the parked Mercedes and the stone wall to its left. Tae-jin held up one hand. Sung-ho stopped. From the shadow between the car and the wall, a child emerged. She was small enough that Tae-jin's first instinct was to revise his estimate of her age downward twice before settling on 7, maybe 8. She was wearing a puffy winter coat that was at least 1 size too big for her, dark blue, with a broken zipper that had been safety pinned shut at the top. Her sneakers were white once, and were now the color of sidewalks. Her hair was in 2 braids that had been neat some number of days ago, and were now showing the particular entropy of a child who had been sleeping in her clothes. Her skin was deep brown, a warm, rich brown that was unusual enough on this street in this part of Seoul that it registered as a detail before anything else did. Before the fear on her face, or the thing she was holding in her hand. She was holding money. Tae-jin looked at the money, and then at her face, and then at the money again, It was a 5001 note and a 1001 note and a 1001 note, crumpled together into a wad that she was holding out toward him with both hands, her arms extended like she was offering something to someone on the other side of a very wide river. Her hands were shaking. Her jaw was set. She was looking directly at him. Not at Sung-ho, not at the men by the door. At him. Like she had done her research and she knew exactly who she needed, and she was not confused about it. Tae-jin had been many things in his life. He had been afraid, genuinely afraid, probably a dozen times. He had been moved in the narrow sense, the grudging internal recognition that something mattered, perhaps fewer times than that. He had stood across from men who were going to die in the next few minutes and felt nothing except the clean, pragmatic clarity of someone finishing a task. He was not prepared for this. "Sir," Sung-ho said, very quietly, pitched only for him. Tae-jin ignored it. He looked at the child for another moment, at her shaking arms and her set jaw and her eyes, which were dark and enormous and completely dry, as if she had already done all the crying she was going to do and had arrived on the other side of it into some country of pure desperate will. And then he crouched down, not all the way to her level, enough to close the distance. "Where did you come from?" he asked. His voice was not soft. It was the same voice he used for everything, low, unhurried, with the particular flatness of someone who had long ago stopped needing his voice to do the emotional work that other people used their voices for. But he kept it level, kept the edge out of it. She didn't answer immediately. She was still holding the money out. Her arms were starting to tremble with the effort of keeping them extended. "I've been waiting," she said finally. Her Korean was accented, not badly. She had clearly grown up speaking it, but with the particular rhythm of someone who spoke another language at home. "Since it got dark. I've been waiting since it got dark." Tae-jin looked at Sung-ho over his shoulder. Sung-ho gave him a nearly imperceptible shrug that communicated, "I have no idea where she came from. I checked this area an hour ago." He looked back at her. "What's your name?" "Amara. Amara." He said it back to her, not as a question, feeling the shape of it. "That's not a Korean name." "My mom is American," she said. "My dad was Korean. He's gone." "Gone how?" "Just gone." Something moved across her face. Not grief exactly, more like the careful filing away of something that was too big to look at directly. "I'm not here about him." Tae-jin almost smiled. He caught it before it happened. "What are you here about?" She pushed the money toward him another inch. Her arms were shaking badly now. "I need to hire you," she said. "I know you're the one who's in charge. I asked people. 3 different people on 3 different streets, and they all said the same name." She swallowed. "I have 7,001. I know it's not a lot, but it's all I have, and I need you to help my mom, and I'll pay you back the rest when I'm older, I promise." Tae-jin was quiet for a moment. Around him, his security team held itself in a state of suspended animation. Nobody was going to say anything. Nobody was going to move, because whatever this was, it was above their pay grade and below it at the same time, and none of them had been trained for it. "Your mother," he said. "She's missing." Amara's voice didn't crack. It stayed steady with an effort that was almost physically visible. "She didn't come home 3 nights ago. She always comes home. She walks me home from school every day, except she didn't, and I waited, and I waited, and I went to the police, and they didn't—" She stopped, breathed, started again. "They didn't listen. They said she probably just left. They said immigrant women sometimes just leave." Her jaw tightened. "My mom would never leave. She would never leave me. Something happened to her and nobody will help. And I heard what you do here, and I know you have people, and I know you can find things that the police can't find, and I need you to find my mom." The wind moved down the street. The ginkgo trees on the main boulevard rattled. Tae-jin looked at the crumpled bills for a long moment. Then he reached out and took them from her hands, and he folded them once, and he put them in the breast pocket of his suit jacket. "Tell me everything," he said. "But—" Her name was Naomi Johnson, and she was 34 years old, and she had been in Seoul for 9 years. Tae-jin got this information in pieces over the next 40 minutes, sitting across from Amara in the small back office of the restaurant that was used for conversations that needed to not be overheard, while one of the kitchen staff brought out a bowl of doenjang jigae and a plate of rice and set them in front of the child without being asked, and Amara ate with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't eaten properly in at least 24 hours. He let her eat. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and he listened. Naomi had come to Seoul on a teaching contract, English language instruction at a private academy in Mapogu. She'd renewed the contract twice, met a Korean man in her third year, had Amara, and then the Korean man had, as Amara had said with that careful evasion, just gone. He'd gone back to Busan, as it happened, to a family that apparently existed and that Naomi had not known about in any meaningful way until it was too late to matter. She'd stayed, because Amara was here and Seoul was the only home Amara had ever known, and Naomi was not the kind of woman who ran from the place where her life had gone wrong. She worked 2 jobs. The academy during the day, and 3 evenings a week she worked as a bookkeeper for a small import business in Yongsan. The import business was where the trouble had started, though Amara didn't know exactly how. She only knew that 2 weeks ago her mother had come home from the evening shift with a tightness around her eyes that she was trying to hide, and that she'd made a phone call in the kitchen with the door closed, speaking in English too fast and too quiet for Amara to follow through the door, and that since then she'd been checking the locks twice before bed. 3 nights ago, Naomi had texted Amara at 3 in the afternoon, "Running a little late, stay at Mrs. Park's until I get there." Mrs. Park was the woman 2 floors down who kept an eye on Amara when Naomi had late shifts, a 60-something widow whose apartment smelled like dried persimmons and old paper, and who watched Korean historical dramas at a volume that could be heard in the hallway. Naomi never arrived. At 9 p.m., Amara had called her mother's phone 12 times. At 10 p.m., she had called it 20 more times. At midnight, Mrs. Park had put her to bed on the small sofa with a blanket that smelled like dried persimmons, and Amara had lain there in the dark, listening to the drama playing in the next room, and had not slept at all. In the morning, she'd gone to the police station in Mapogu. The officer who'd spoken to her had been tired in the specific way of someone who had already decided before the conversation started how it was going to go. He'd asked her mother's nationality. He'd asked how long she'd been in Korea. He'd asked if her mother had any history of drinking or depression or personal instability, with a face that suggested he'd already answered the question himself. He'd given Amara a number to call if her mother hadn't turned up in 72 hours and sent her back out to the sidewalk. She'd spent the rest of the morning and all of the afternoon asking questions. She was 7 years old. She had asked questions of the woman at the corner convenience store and the man who ran the pojangmatcha on the next block and the older boys who hung out in front of the PC cafe 2 streets over, and she had pieced together, through the particular genius of children who have not yet learned to be subtle, a rough map of power in that part of the city. Everyone she'd asked had eventually, with varying degrees of reluctance, said the same thing: Black Tiger, Cheongdam-dong, the restaurant with no sign. Taejin listened to all of this without moving. When she finished, the bowl in front of her was empty, and she was sitting with her hands in her lap, and the set jaw was back, that iron determination that looked wrong and exactly right on a 7-year-old's face simultaneously. "The import business in Yongsan," Taejin said. "Do you know the name of it?" K&S Trading. That's what was on the business card my mom had on the refrigerator. He looked at Sung-ho, who was standing by the door. Sung-ho nodded once and left. "You said she seemed scared," Taejin said. 2 weeks before she disappeared. Did she say anything to you? Anything at all?" Amara thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way children do when they're taking a question seriously. Her eyes went somewhere inward, pulling at threads. "She said the people at the night job weren't who she thought they were," Amara said slowly. "She said she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and she said—" She stopped. "Say it." "She said if anything ever happened to her, I should go to Mrs. Park and stay there until she came back. And she looked at me like—" Amara's voice, for the first time, went slightly unsteady. Just slightly. "She looked at me like she was scared it might actually happen." Taejin was quiet. He had a daughter. She was 17 and lived with her mother in Bundang, and he saw her twice a month on a schedule that had been arranged by lawyers, and had never in the 11 years since the divorce felt like anything other than a formal transaction. And he was not a man who spent time on regret, because regret was a luxury he'd decided early that he couldn't afford. But he had a daughter, and she was 17, and something moved behind his sternum that he would not have been able to name and would not have tried. "You're going to stay here tonight," he said. Amara opened her mouth. "Not a discussion," he said, without raising his voice. "You're going to stay here, and you're going to be safe, and tomorrow—" He stopped. Recalibrated. "Tonight. By tonight, I'll know more about where your mother is." "You're going to help?" Her voice was careful, like she didn't want to put too much weight on it in case it broke. "I took your money," he said. That means I work for you now. So K&S Trading had 3 floors of official records and approximately 11 years of unofficial history that the official records did not reflect. Sung-ho brought the summary to Tae-jin at 11:15 p.m. in the same back office, sliding a folder across the table with the efficient absence of ceremony that Tae-jin had always valued in him. Sung-ho was 45 and had been with the Black Tiger Syndicate for 19 years and had the kind of institutional memory that made him effectively irreplaceable. He knew not just what was in the files, but what should have been in the files and wasn't, and why, and who had made the decision to leave it out. The import business was a front. That much was obvious within 30 seconds of reading. The declared goods, industrial textiles, commercial kitchen equipment, a truly improbable volume of stationery, didn't match the warehouse space, the staffing costs, or the electricity consumption. The company had changed its registered directors 4 times in 3 years. It had no public website and 3 shell company relationships that Sung-ho had traced through Macau and the British Virgin Islands, and 1 registered address in Incheon that did not correspond to any building that currently existed. The current operators, Tae-jin said, best guess from the registration trail and some other channels, a group called Sindo. They've been operating in the port district for about 2 years, moving product through Incheon mostly. Sung-ho's voice stayed level. The product being women. Tae-jin looked up from the folder. Trafficking, he said. Immigrant women specifically. Southeast Asian and African nationals mostly, a few Central Asian, some Eastern European. Women who are here on contract work or student visas, isolated, limited social networks, limited access to official channels. They identify targets, manufacture a debt, usually through some fake financial scheme connected to their employment. And when the target refuses to pay or can't pay, they take them. How long has this been running? In Seoul? 18 months. But the same network, or something connected to it, has been operating out of Incheon Port for at least 4 years. We're not talking about small numbers. Sung-ho paused. This is a serious international operation. Tae-jin closed the folder. He was thinking about something Sung-ho had said. In Seoul. In Seoul, which meant inside the zone of operations that the Black Tiger Syndicate had maintained for a decade, through agreements that had been negotiated and tested, and in some cases enforced violently, and in all cases held. The syndicate's authority in this part of Seoul was not merely practical. It was foundational. It was the reason businesses paid their fees without complaint, the reason other organizations operated at a distance, the reason a woman walking home at 3 a.m. on certain streets had a reasonable expectation of safety. That expectation was not incidental. It was deliberate. It was maintained. 18 months. They had been operating inside his territory for 18 months, and he hadn't known. That was a problem that had several components, and he would address them in order, and the first component was the most immediate. How many women are currently held? He asked. Unknown. We think there's a primary holding facility near the port, the warehouse network they're using for the textile import. Based on ship movements over the last 6 weeks, the next transport is probably within 48 hours. Sung-ho met his eyes. If they move the women before we find the location, the window closes. Where's Naomi Johnson? Can't confirm yet, but if the pattern holds, she's at the primary facility. Tae-jin stood. He found Amara asleep on the small couch in the corner of the office, her head tilted sideways against the armrest, her broken zipped coat pulled up around her shoulders by someone, probably one of the kitchen staff. He had not given the instruction himself, but he noted that it had happened and filed it somewhere. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She had fallen asleep with her phone in her hand, a cheap thing with a cracked screen. And in sleep she looked younger than she had when she was awake. The set jaw had released. Whatever iron thing she'd been holding up all day was down. He thought about what it had taken for her to do what she'd done today. To walk out of Mrs. Park's apartment into a city that had already proved it wasn't going to help her, with 7001 and a name she'd extracted from 3 different conversations with adults who had probably tried to discourage her, and stand in the dark in front of his restaurant and hold out her money to the man she'd been told was the most dangerous person in the neighborhood. He was the most dangerous person in the neighborhood. He had done things that would have destroyed the 7-year-old's image of him if she knew them. He had made decisions about human life with less consideration than most people gave to choosing a restaurant, and he had made peace with that, or something that looked like peace, years ago. But she had looked at him and seen someone who could help, not someone who was good. Someone who was powerful enough to do what the legitimate structures of the city had refused to do. She had made a pragmatic calculation with a child's directness and a desperate person's clarity, and the calculation had brought her here. He did not want to think about what happened if he couldn't deliver. He didn't let himself think about it. He walked quietly past the doorway and down the corridor to where Sung Ho was waiting with 3 of the senior lieutenants and the maps of the Incheon Port District spread across the table. The planning took 4 hours. The problem was not manpower. The Black Tiger Syndicate had 47 active field operatives in the greater Seoul area, and Taejin could have doubled that number with 24 hours' notice and tripled it in 48. Manpower was not the constraint. The constraints were intelligence and time. They knew the approximate location of the facility. A warehouse complex in the industrial district outside Incheon Port, 3 structures connected by a covered loading area. They did not know the internal layout. They did not know the number of guards. They did not know how many women were being held or where within the complex, which mattered enormously because a breaching operation that started shooting without knowing where the hostages were was an operation that might solve one problem by creating another. Taejin had a man in Incheon. His name was Byun Cheol, and he had worked the port for 6 years and knew the freight handlers and the dock operators and several of the customs officials at the level of genuine familiarity rather than mere acquaintance. By 1:30 in the morning, Byun Cheol was in the industrial district on foot, using the network of relationships he'd spent 6 years building, asking questions in the way that did not sound like asking questions. By 3:45 a.m., Taejin had the internal layout. He also had the guard count, 12 on rotation, 4 per shift, with the shifts changing at midnight and 8 a.m. He had the location of the primary holding area, the easternmost of the 3 connected structures, ground floor, a section that had been modified from a standard freight warehouse into something with interior walls and locks. He had the information that the women inside were not restrained with anything more than locked doors and the straightforward threat of violence, which meant a fast, clean entry was possible without the kind of close-quarters chaos that ended badly. He also had the information that one of the guards carried a radio on a channel that was checked by a relay in Incheon proper every 30 minutes, and that if the check-in was missed, a protocol would initiate. That meant he had a window. "We move at 4:15, he said. "After the midnight check-in, but before the 8 a.m. shift change. The window for the relay check is 4:17. We're in and done before the relay fires." Nobody asked questions. The men around the table had worked with him long enough to understand that his operations plans were not invitations to discussion. They were finished products that incorporated the discussion he'd already had with himself. They asked questions only when something was unclear, and nothing here was unclear. Sung Ho walked him through the team assignments. Entry team. 6 men through the north loading doors, which Byun Cheol had confirmed were on a mechanical lock that could be defeated quietly. Perimeter team. 4 men covering exits and preventing anything from going in or out once the operation started. Rescue team. 5 men moving directly to the eastern structure, with 2 medical personnel. The syndicate maintained 2 people with actual training, not just the crude triage that most organizations settled for, ready to receive and assess. Taejin would lead the entry team. Sung Ho said nothing about this. It was a discussion they'd had variations of before, and its outcome had always been the same, and they had both accepted this. At 4 a.m., Taejin went back to the office. Amara was still asleep. The phone had slipped from her hand onto the couch cushion beside her. Someone, the same someone, had taken off her sneakers and lined them up neatly on the floor. He stood there for a moment in the doorway with the weight of what the next 4 hours were going to require sitting on him the way weight always sat on him. Not heavily, not dramatically, but with the dense, specific gravity of things that were real. He had promised her. He had taken her money, which was the same as making a promise. He had made promises before that he had not been able to keep, and he had made peace with those, or something that looked like peace. This one felt different. He couldn't have said exactly why. He was not a man who excavated his own motivations with any particular enthusiasm. What he knew was that he had a 4-hour drive to Incheon and a warehouse full of people who had decided that women without strong connections could be turned into product, and that somewhere in that warehouse was a woman whose daughter had walked across a dark city alone and held out 7,001 because she believed that even the worst men sometimes chose right. He turned away from the doorway. In the corridor, he found one of the kitchen staff, a young woman, 22 or 3, who had been working late on prep for tomorrow's service and who had apparently taken it on herself to check on the child twice in the last 2 hours. If she wakes up, Taejin said quietly, tell her I kept my promise. The young woman nodded. He walked toward the exit where the convoy was waiting. Outside, the sky over Seoul was the color of iron, and the air smelled like rain that still hadn't fallen, and the ginkgo leaves on the main boulevard were tearing loose one at a time in a wind that had picked up from the west. Taejin got into the lead vehicle. The convoy moved. They were 40 minutes out of Seoul, the city lights falling behind them and the highway opening up through the dark agricultural flatlands south of the capital, when Sung-ho's phone lit up. He looked at the screen, looked at Taejin. What? Taejin said. Byun Cheol. Sung-ho's voice had gone careful in the way it went careful when information was changing the shape of the situation. He went back for a second pass on the facility. He says he counted wrong. Wrong how? Guard count isn't 12. Sung-ho paused. It's 22. And there are 2 vehicles in the loading yard he didn't see before, transit vans, commercial plates. Taejin looked at the road. 22 guards instead of 12, and transit vans that hadn't been there 3 hours ago. The transit vans meant one of 2 things. Either they were bringing more women in, which was bad, or they were getting ready to move the women out, which was worse, which meant the window wasn't 4:50. The window was now. He pulled out his phone and began making calls, and the convoy accelerated through the dark. And somewhere in a warehouse outside Incheon Port, a 34-year-old woman named Naomi Johnson was either still there or already. The convoy didn't slow down. Taejin made 3 calls in 4 minutes, and the calls were not conversations. They were instructions delivered in the compressed, specific language of people who had done this before, where every unnecessary word was a second that something could go wrong. He told the rear vehicles to close the gap. He told Byun Cheol to hold his position and not move, not under any circumstances, until he heard otherwise. He told a man named Oh Jae-won, who was the closest thing the Black Tiger Syndicate had to a tactical coordinator, that the guard count had nearly doubled, and that the operation was moving up by 40 minutes. Oh Jae-won said, how many more men do you want? How fast can you get them to Incheon? 40 minutes if I call right now. Call right now. He hung up and looked at the road and did the arithmetic. 22 guards, 6 entry team, 4 perimeter, 5 rescue, 2 medical. That was 17, plus himself and Sung-ho, 19. Against 22, in a facility whose layout he knew from one man's single nighttime pass, with the complication of transit vans that suggested either an incoming or outgoing movement of women, and either way meant chaos he hadn't planned for. Chaewon's additional men would arrive 40 minutes after the call. By then, the window would either be open or closed, and the operation would either have started or, and this was the thing he was not going to let happen, the vans would be gone. He made the calculation. We go in with what we have, he said. Sung-ho didn't answer immediately. In 19 years, Sung-ho had developed a very specific silence for situations where he disagreed with the decision, but understood that the decision had already been made. It lasted approximately 3 seconds and communicated everything it needed to communicate, and then it ended. Understood, Sung-ho said. The industrial district outside Incheon Port smelled like salt and diesel, and the particular cold that comes off water in October. A wet cold, penetrating, that worked its way under clothing and into joints. The road into the district was unmarked, running between chain-link fences hung with rust-colored tarps, the kind of industrial no-man's land that exists in every port city in the world and looks exactly the same in all of them. Functional, ugly, indifferent to anyone who might be moving through it at 4 in the morning. The convoy stopped 300 meters from the facility and went dark. Headlights off, engines off, 12 men in tactical gear stepping out onto gravel with the careful silence of people who knew what silence cost. Taejin moved to where Byun Cheol was crouched behind a corrugated metal storage unit 20 meters from the facility's north perimeter. Byun Cheol was a small man, lean, with the permanently squinting expression of someone who spent most of his professional life watching things he wasn't supposed to be watching. He pointed at the facility without speaking. Through the gap in the perimeter fence that he indicated, Taejin could see the loading yard. 2 transit vans, white, commercial plates, backed up to the south loading bay. Both were running. Exhaust curled up into the cold air. How long have those been running? Taejin said, barely a whisper. Since I called, Byun Cheol said. 15 minutes. Anybody move between the facility and the vans? Not yet, but 2 guards came out and checked the yard about 5 minutes ago. Checked the perimeter fence on the east side. Then went back in. Taejin looked at the vans. Running for 15 minutes, nobody moving yet. Preloading check of the perimeter. He'd seen this pattern before from the other side. It was the pattern of an organization that was organized, that had a procedure for this, that had done it enough times to have a procedure. They were loading. They just hadn't started loading yet, which meant the women were still inside. He pulled back from the fence and moved to where Sung-ho had assembled the team in a tight cluster behind the storage unit. 14 men in a semicircle, close enough that he didn't need to raise his voice. "Change of plan," he said. "The south loading bay is active. 2 vans, engines running. They're preparing to move the women. We cannot wait for Chaewon's men." He paused. "Entry team takes the north loading doors as planned, but the timing is now. The moment we're through the north entrance, rescue team moves directly, not cautiously, directly, to the eastern holding area. Perimeter team's priority is those 2 vans. Nobody drives those vans anywhere. Am I clear?" 14 heads, a few tight nods. The women inside are not combatants. If a guard is between you and a woman and the guard is not already complying, the guard is not a concern. But if a woman runs, and some of them will run, some of them will panic and run, nobody grabs anyone. You identify yourself, you stay calm, and you let the medical team do the work. He looked around the circle. Any questions? Silence. Not the nervous silence of men who had questions they were afraid to ask. The operational silence of men who had absorbed their instructions and were ready to move. "We go in 60 seconds, he said. The north loading door lock took 11 seconds. The man who did it was named Ryu, 29, and he had fingers that could disassemble a mechanical lock with the calm efficiency of someone solving a familiar puzzle, and he had it open in 11 seconds with the hydraulic bolt retractor that made no sound louder than a breath. The door swung inward on hinges that had been oiled recently, which was a detail that struck Taejin as absurd. That whoever ran this facility was careful enough about operational security to oil the hinges, but not careful enough to not run their transit vans for 15 minutes before loading. They moved through the door in a single file that spread immediately once they were inside. The interior was large, a full-sized freight warehouse, maybe 40 meters by 30, with 20-foot ceilings and concrete floors, and the halogens turned down to a maintenance level that left most of the space in deep gray shadow. Shipping containers lined the west wall, 3 high. Pallets of the declared goods, the industrial textiles and kitchen equipment that K&S Trading officially imported, were stacked in organized rows near the center, and looking at them now, Taejin felt a cold, specific contempt, because the mundane fakery of it, the sheer administrative banality of using invoice stationary orders as cover for this, was somehow more infuriating than open brutality. 2 guards in the main warehouse. Both turned at the sound of the door opening. Taejin's entry team was already moving. It was fast. It was not clean. Nothing was ever clean, but it was fast. And the 2 guards were on the concrete floor with their hands secured before either of them had managed to do anything more consequential than open their mouths. One of them tried to reach for the radio on his belt and didn't reach it. "How many more inside?" Taejin said, crouching over the one who looked more alert. He was speaking Korean and his voice was flat and not loud. The guard said nothing. Taejin put his knee on the man's wrist with a precise, controlled pressure that was not about pain exactly. It was about communication, about the message being received clearly, and asked again. 6, the guard said. 3 in the east section, 2 by the loading bay, 1 in the office. The office where? North side, 2nd floor, stairs by the textiles. Taejin stood. The rescue team was already through the passage that connected the main warehouse to the eastern structure when Taejin reached the foot of the stairs to the north office. Sung-ho went up first, 2 at a time, completely silent, and Taejin followed. The office was a glass-fronted enclosure overlooking the main warehouse floor, the kind installed in freight facilities so supervisors could observe the loading operations below. From the outside, through the glass, Taejin could see a man at a desk. 50s. Heavy. Wearing a fleece vest over a dress shirt, a cup of something warm in one hand, a tablet in the other, with the expression of a man monitoring a routine process. He was monitoring the loading operation. He didn't hear them until the door opened. His face, when he looked up from the tablet and saw Taejin, did something complicated and rapid. Disbelief first, then recognition of what the recognition implied, then fear, and then the particular blankness of someone running very fast through options and finding none of them useful. Kang Tai Jin, he said. His name said with that particular flatness meant this man knew exactly who he was and had presumably factored him into his operational calculations at some point in the last 18 months, and determined that the Black Tiger Syndicate was not a threat. Tai Jin was interested in that determination. He was going to be interested in it for as long as it took to understand how it had been made, because that determination had been wrong, and the way it had been wrong told him something about his own organization's visibility problems. But that was not the immediate conversation. "Stand up," Tai Jin said. The man stood. He was slightly taller than Tai Jin had estimated from the doorway, 6 feet roughly, with the kind of bulk that had been muscle once and had migrated over the years into something less defined. He kept the cup in his hand, a small and probably unconscious choice, something to hold. "You have women here," Tai Jin said. "I have an import business," the man said. Tai Jin looked at him. "I have records," the man said. "All my import paperwork is completely—" "The van's outside," Tai Jin said. "The engines have been running for 20 minutes. Where are you moving them tonight?" The man's jaw worked. "I don't know what you—" "The last time someone lied to me in this kind of situation," Tai Jin said, without raising his voice, without shifting his weight, "the conversation took longer than I wanted it to take. I'm going to ask you one more time about those vans, and then I'm going to stop asking and start working with what I already know, and you're going to find that what I already know is enough to make the asking irrelevant." A long pause. Below them, through the glass, Tai Jin could hear the sounds of the operation, the muffled movement of boots on concrete, a door slamming somewhere in the east section, a voice that was not one of his men speaking Korean in a rapid, frightened stream. The man heard it too. His shoulders dropped by maybe 2 centimeters. The cup stayed in his hand. "Busan," he said. "The transfer point in Busan. From there they go by ship." "How many women in this facility right now?" A longer pause. 11, he said. 11. Tai Jin kept his face still. "Naomi Johnson," he said. "American national, Black Korean-American daughter. She was brought here 3 nights ago." The man looked at him with something that might, in different circumstances, have been curiosity. "Why her specifically?" "She's who I was hired to find." The man shook his head slowly as if the answer disappointed him philosophically. "She's here. East section. She wasn't cooperative. She's been separated from the others." "What does separated mean?" "She's secured. She's not—" He stopped. "She's alive. She's not harmed. She was secured because she wouldn't stop trying to find a way out." Tai Jin thought about a woman who had been taken 3 nights ago, who had left a text message telling her daughter she was running late, and who had been spending the time since looking for a way out of a room she was locked in while her 7-year-old daughter walked across a city in the dark with crumpled money in her hands. He turned to Sung Ho. "Go." Sung Ho went. It came apart partially in the east section. The guards, 3 of them, as the man on the floor in the main warehouse had said, had apparently been listening to the sounds from the north and had made the calculation that something had gone wrong, and 2 of them had barricaded themselves inside the primary holding room rather than attempting to move out into the facility. The 3rd had gone the other way, moving toward the south loading bay where the vans were, and he made it as far as the exterior door before the perimeter team intercepted him, and that interception was not quiet. The sound of it, 3 shots, suppressed but not silent, then a crash, traveled through the facility walls and hit the east section just as the rescue team was working the door of the holding room. Inside the holding room, someone screamed. Then several people screamed. The rescue team's lead man, a veteran named Do, pressed himself against the wall beside the door and said, loudly and with a deliberate evenness, in Korean and then in English, "We are not Sindo. We are here to get you out. Nobody is going to be touched. We need you to move back from the door so we can open it safely." Silence from inside. The particular silence of people who have had enough reasons to not trust what they hear. "There are 11 of you," Do said. "I'm going to count to 5 and then we're going to open this door, and you're going to see we're not here to hurt you. If any of you speaks Korean, tell the others." A pause. Then faintly, a voice inside. A woman's voice speaking rapidly in something that wasn't Korean. Another pause. Then, in Korean, heavily accented, "Okay." The door opened. Sung Ho found Naomi Johnson in a storage room 15 meters down the east corridor, behind a door that was padlocked from the outside. The separated room the man upstairs had mentioned, the room for the woman who wouldn't stop trying to find a way out. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the far wall and her knees drawn up to her chest when the door opened, and she went still in the way of an animal that has learned that sudden movement in enclosed spaces is usually bad news. She was wearing the clothes she'd been taken in, dark jeans, a gray hoodie, sneakers that were still on her feet, which meant she'd been keeping them on deliberately, which meant she'd been maintaining the mental state of someone who was going to need to run. She looked at Sung Ho. She looked at the tactical gear, at the absence of the Sindo organization's markers. She'd clearly been paying attention to what her captors looked like and how they moved, at the open door behind him. "Who are you?" Her voice was raw. 3 days of limited sleep and sustained fear, and it was still level. "Kang Tai-jin sent me," Sung Ho said. She stared at him. "I don't know that name." "Your daughter does." The stillness that followed lasted approximately 1 second, and then Naomi Johnson was on her feet. In the North office, Tai-jin was finishing a different conversation. The facility manager, his name, it had emerged from the documents Tai-jin's team was pulling from the filing cabinets, and the tablet and the desktop computer was Han Gyu-sok, had graduated from reluctant cooperation to the particular loquaciousness of a man who had accurately assessed that talking was the only remaining tool available to him. He was telling Tai-jin about the network. Not everything. Tai-jin was not naive about what a man tells you under pressure, which is always a curated version of the truth shaped toward whatever outcome the man thinks the telling will produce. Han was intelligent enough to be doing this, and Tai-jin was intelligent enough to know he was doing it. But even a curated version contained information, and the information Han was providing had the texture of something real, specific names, specific ports, specific financial arrangements that were too detailed and too internally consistent to be entirely fabricated on the spot. The network was large. Not just Seoul, not just Korea. 6 transit points across 3 countries. Financial infrastructure running through at least 2 major banking systems. A client network that Han described with the clinical detachment of a logistics manager describing a distribution chain, and listening to it, Tai-jin felt something he rarely felt, something slower and colder than the operational anger he was used to, something that had more patience in it and less heat. This was going to take more than one night. "The men above you in this organization," Tai-jin said, "the people who gave you this facility and told you where to move the women and who gave you the financial structure you're describing, who are they?" Han looked at him steadily. "That's the part that doesn't stay in Seoul." "I know. That's the part that doesn't stay in Korea." "I know that too. If I give you those names—" Han stopped. The cup was still in his hand, empty now, cold. "If I give you those names, this doesn't stay quiet. Whatever you do here tonight, that stays quiet because you want it to. But those names don't stay quiet. Those names go somewhere. And when they go somewhere, the people those names belong to are going to want to know where they came from." "Yes," Tai-jin said. "And you're willing to carry that?" Tai-jin looked at him for a moment with the flat, unhurried patience that was the only thing he'd inherited from his father. Everything else he'd built or stolen or burned away, but that particular stillness in the face of a man who thought leverage was a universal currency had come down to him genetically. "I've been carrying things since before you started this operation," he said. "Give me the names." Han gave him the names. Tai-jin had Sung Ho photograph every document in the room and copy every file from the computer onto a drive before they left. And standing there in the harsh light of the North office, while the facility was being systematically cleared below him, and the sound of frightened women being moved through a warehouse mixed with the sharp, efficient voices of his men, he looked at the list of names on the screen and understood for the first time the full size of what Amara's 7001 had bought. This was not a rescue operation anymore, or it was a rescue operation. It would always primarily be a rescue operation because Naomi Johnson was what this had been about since a small girl stood in the cold with crumpled money in her hands. But it was also the first thread of something larger, and Tai-jin had enough experience with threads to know that once you pulled one, you were committed to following it wherever it led. And the names on that screen led somewhere that was going to require him to make decisions he hadn't made yet about how far he was willing to go and who he was willing to go against. He was still looking at the screen when he heard Sung Ho's voice in the corridor below. And then, underneath it, a woman's voice, sharp and frightened and fighting to stay steady. And then running footsteps, and Tae-jin stepped back from the screen and moved to the office door and looked down at the warehouse floor. Naomi Johnson was moving through the main warehouse with Sung-ho beside her, and she was looking around at the facility, at the shipping containers, at the pallets of fake goods, at the guards seated on the floor with their hands secured, and her face had the particular expression of someone who had been holding a very specific fear for 3 days and was now in the process of finding out whether what they were walking into was better or worse than what they'd been imagining. And the jury was not yet in. She looked up. She saw Tae-jin at the office railing. He came down the stairs. They stood 4 feet apart on the concrete floor of the warehouse, and she looked at him with eyes that were exhausted and sharpened and not remotely close to tears, and she said, "Where is my daughter?" "She's safe," he said. "She's in Seoul." "Is she—" "She's fine. She's been fed. She's asleep." He paused. "She was very smart about how she found me." Naomi Johnson's face did something complicated and rapid, not entirely unlike what Han Gyu-suk's face had done when they'd walked into his office. Disbelief, then recognition, then an emotion that didn't have a clean name, but had something to do with the gap between the worst thing you'd been imagining and the thing that was actually true. Except in her case, the gap ran the other way. "I have to go to her," Naomi said. "We're leaving in 8 minutes," Tae-jin said. "There are 10 other women who are coming with us. The vehicles have room." 10. She looked around, a reflex, absorbing the scale of it. "This is bigger than me." "Yes. You knew that before you came." "I found out before I came." She held his eyes for a moment. Her jaw was set in a way that had a particular familiar quality, and it took him a beat to identify it. It was Amar's jaw, the same line of determination, and it was clearly genetic and had clearly been passed down with full intensity. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We're not out of here." He was right, because at that moment, from the direction of the south loading bay where the 2 vans were still idling in the cold outside, there came the sound of an engine, not one of the transit vans, something heavier, and then the sound of a gate, and then 2 of Tae-jin's perimeter team came through the door at a pace that communicated everything before either of them said a word, and what they said when they reached him was that a vehicle had come in through the service entrance on the south side, a panel truck, and that it had 4 men in it who were not Sindo's regular security, who were carrying hardware that was different from anything the facility guards had been carrying, and who had moved with an efficiency that suggested they were not warehouse security, but something else. Something above the facility's usual operational tier, and the reason they had arrived in the middle of the night at an active facility was one of 2 things. Either routine command oversight, or they already knew something was wrong. 12 minutes, Tae-jin thought. They'd been inside 12 minutes, and the relay check was at 4:17, which was still 11 minutes away. So not the relay, which meant one of the guards had managed to communicate before they'd been secured, or someone outside the facility had seen something on the approach, or the organization above Han Gyu-seok ran a tighter oversight loop than Han had described. Any of those possibilities arrived at the same point. The operation had just become something he could not finish cleanly. Tae-jin said, "How many exits on the south side besides the loading bay?" "1," the perimeter man said. "Side door, east wall of the south structure. It opens onto the service road." "The women, where are they now?" "Still in the east section. DOH has them moving, but they're slow. 2 of them can't walk without support." Tae-jin looked at the main warehouse floor. 11 women somewhere in the east corridor behind him. 2 who couldn't walk. 10 of his men in various positions across the facility. 4 new arrivals on the south side whose professional quality had already been established by the speed with which they'd come through the service gate. He had maybe 3 minutes before those 4 men understood the full scope of what they'd walked into and made a call that brought more. "Sung-ho," he said. Sung-ho was already beside him. "Get Naomi to the east exit. Stay with her. Don't stop moving regardless of what you hear." Sung-ho looked at him with the 3-second silence. "Go," Tae-jin said. Sung-ho took Naomi's arm. She started to pull back, her eyes going to Tae-jin with a question that was also an objection. And Tae-jin said to her, "Your daughter is waiting," and that was the end of the objection. She went. Tae-jin pulled Ryu aside. "North doors, back the way we came in. Take 4 men and move the women out that way. All of them. Fast." "2 can't walk," Ryu said. "Then carry them." He turned toward the south. Go. The 4 men from this panel truck were professionals. That was the thing that clarified itself in the first 30 seconds of contact, and it clarified it in the specific way that professional violence always distinguishes itself from amateur violence, not through intensity, but through economy. They didn't waste movement. They communicated with each other in signals that were prearranged and minimal. They had cleared the south loading bay of the two van drivers before Taejin's perimeter team had fully registered what was happening, which meant they'd assessed the situation, vans running, drivers standing outside, no sign of regular security, and made an immediate decision about the drivers that told Taejin they were not here on an oversight visit. They'd been sent to clean up, not to retrieve the women, not to reinforce the facility, to clean it. Which meant someone above Han Gyu-suk, someone whose name was on the list that Han had just given Taejin, had already known something was wrong before Taejin's convoy had pulled off the highway. Had known, and had sent 4 men to eliminate the problem. The women, the facility, the evidence, before it could be extracted. Han Gyu-suk, upstairs in the North Office, had just become a liability to the people he worked for. Taejin processed this in the time it took him to move from the center of the main warehouse to the passage that connected to the south loading bay, and when he came through that passage, it was in a crouch, fast, with 2 of his entry team flanking him, and what he saw in the loading bay was one of the white transit vans with its rear doors open, and one of his perimeter men on the concrete floor, not moving. The other perimeter man was pressed behind a steel support column 12 meters away, and he looked at Taejin with the specific expression of someone who needed instruction immediately. Taejin held up 4 fingers, pointed south. The man nodded. One of the 4 was already in the facility then. The other 3 had gone somewhere else. The east side, almost certainly, moving to cut off the exit that Sung-ho was taking Naomi toward. Taejin changed direction. He came through the east corridor at a run and caught up with Sung-ho and Naomi 30 meters from the side door, and he was close enough to see Sung-ho's hand on Naomi's back, pushing her forward and far enough away that when the side door opened from the outside, he couldn't reach them before it opened. One man through the door. Tactical vest, no markings, a weapon that he brought up in one smooth practiced motion, and which Taejin's own weapon came up to meet in the same fraction of a second, and they were 8 meters apart and neither of them fired. Because Naomi was between them. Not deliberately. She'd been moving toward the door when it opened and she'd stopped, and now she was standing in the space between 2 men with raised weapons, and she had the particular stillness of someone who understood the geometry of the situation completely. "Move left," Taejin said to her quietly. She moved left. The shot Taejin fired was low. A deliberate choice, not the center mass shot that training and instinct both wanted, but the leg shot that was harder and slower and carried a very specific message. I need you to go down and stay down, and I need to be able to talk to you afterward. It worked. The man went down against the door frame with a sound that was mostly air, and the weapon clattered on the concrete, and Taejin crossed the 8 meters in 3 seconds and kicked the weapon away and crouched over him. "Where are the others?" he said. The man on the floor was breathing in short, controlled increments, managing the pain with the discipline of someone who had been trained to function through it. He looked up at Taejin with eyes that were assessing rather than frightened. "You're Kong Taejin," he said. Not a question. The same flat recognition that Han had shown. "Where are the other 3? The man's jaw tightened, the calculating look. Running the same options Han had run. What to say, what it bought, what it cost. "They're not coming here," he said. "That's not what they were sent for." Taejin looked at him. What were they sent for? The office. The documentation. A pause, each breath measured. "And Han." Taejin stood up. He looked at Sung-ho. "Get her out. All the way out to the vehicles. Don't stop." He turned back toward the North Office. And he was too late. He knew it before he reached the stairs. Knew it from the sound that had already stopped. The particular absence of sound that a space has when something final has occurred in it and the air is still settling around the shape of it. He went up the stairs anyway, 2 at a time, and through the office door. Han Gyu-suk was at his desk. He was not going to tell Taejin anything else. The tablet was gone. The desktop computer screen had been dark. Not turned off, physically removed. The monitor and the tower both, leaving only cables trailing across the empty desk surface like shed skin. The filing cabinet drawers were open. Every one, all of them empty. 12 years of documentation, the accumulated paper evidence of an international trafficking operation, removed in the time it had taken Taejin to deal with the man at the side door. Sung-ho's photographs were on his phone, the files on the drive, but the drive had been in Sung-ho's jacket, not left in the room, and that was the only good piece of news in this space. Everything else was gone. Tae-jin stood in the middle of the office and looked at the empty desk and at Han and at the absent equipment, and he felt something shift inside the operational clarity he'd been running on for the last 4 hours. Not breaking, not collapsing, but shifting, the way the ground shifts in the moment before something gives way underneath it. He'd gotten the names, he'd gotten the photographs and the files, but someone outside this facility had known he was coming, had known it early enough to dispatch a clean team, had known not just that the facility was compromised, but specifically what the documentation contained and how to remove it surgically in the window between the time Tae-jin's convoy had arrived and now. That kind of knowledge didn't come from a guard with a radio. He went back down the stairs. Whomped. Outside, the cold hit him like something physical. The east side door was open and the service road was empty. Sung-ho had gotten Naomi out, which meant Ryu had gotten the women out through the north, which meant the women were at the vehicles, which meant the operational objective was achieved. He should be moving. He was standing in the doorframe of a facility that had just had its documentation removed by professionals who worked for people whose names he had on a drive in his lieutenant's jacket, and he should be moving. He stood there for 10 more seconds. He was thinking about the clean team. 4 men, professionals, deployed fast. Someone had seen his convoy leave Seoul. That was possible. His convoy was not invisible, and his route to Incheon was not secret. Or someone had been monitoring the facility remotely and had seen them arrive. Either way, the decision to deploy the team had been made quickly, and the team had moved quickly, which meant there was an infrastructure for this kind of rapid response that had been pre-positioned. That infrastructure was what the names on the drive pointed toward, and that infrastructure had a leak in it somewhere between the men who had given those names, because Han had said them aloud in a room with a man he was trying to manage, which meant Han had calculated that giving the names wouldn't matter, which meant Han had believed the clean team would arrive before Tae-jin could leave with them. Han had been almost right. Tae-jin walked to the vehicles. Tug. Naomi Johnson was in the second vehicle, sitting in the back seat behind Sung-ho, and she looked at Tae-jin when he got in with the controlled assessment of someone who had been using the last 10 minutes to think rather than react. She'd pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. Not a defeated posture, a contained one. The posture of someone holding themselves in while they processed. The other women, she said, in the third vehicle. The medical people are with them. Are they alive? Some of them are in bad shape. We're going to take care of that. She nodded. She looked at the window. The industrial district moved past outside, dark and indifferent. I know what that place was, she said. Yes. I've been there 3 days. I know what was going to happen to us tonight. Yes. And I know... She stopped, looked at her hands. I know this isn't just about me. What you found in that office. I saw you go up there. I heard... She paused at the clean space where sound had been. I know this is something bigger. It is, Tae-jin said. Are we safe? My daughter and me specifically, are we safe now? Tae-jin looked at her for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. The honest answer was that 11 women were alive who would not have been alive in 6 hours. The honest answer was also that the people whose names were on the drive were now aware that someone had raided their facility, had extracted their documentation, and had removed their clean team's primary target before it could be handled. The honest answer was that those people had resources and reach, and the specific motivation of people who have had a liability management problem turn into an evidence problem. You're safe for tonight, he said. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes after tonight. She held his eyes. That's not the same as yes. No, he said. It isn't. The convoy moved north through the dark toward Seoul. Besant. They were 40 minutes out when Sung-ho's phone lit up again. Tae-jin watched Sung-ho look at the screen and watched Sung-ho's face do something it almost never did in the front seat during an active operation. It went still in a way that was not operational stillness, but something personal, something that the professional surface didn't fully contain. What? Tae-jin said. Sung-ho passed the phone back without speaking. The message was from Oh Jae-won, who had been coordinating the additional team out of Seoul. It was short. It said, Security breach at Cheongdam, restaurant, 30 minutes ago. I'm sorry. Tae-jin read it twice. 30 minutes ago, while he was standing in the north office looking at Han's body and the empty desk, 3 men had entered the Black Tiger Syndicate's restaurant in Cheongdam-dong. They had not come for the kitchen staff. They had not come for the bar. The back office where Amara had fallen asleep on the small couch. The office where the kitchen girl had taken off her sneakers and lined them up neatly on the floor had been the target. Taejin dialed Chae-won. It picked up on the first ring. "The child," Taejin said. A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "The child is gone," Jae-won said. "Taejin. She was taken. I have 2 men down, and the kitchen girl is in the hospital. They came in fast. They knew exactly where she was. They knew—" His voice tightened. "They knew she was there. They took her and they left a phone, a clean phone, on the table in the back office." Taejin heard this. He heard all of it, each word arriving with the clean, specific weight of information that changed the shape of everything that followed it. Amara, 7 years old, taken from a couch where she'd fallen asleep with a cracked screen phone in her hand. Used. He was used. He had been moved by a child's courage and had taken her money and put her in a room and gone to Incheon, and the people he'd gone to deal with had known about the girl, had known she was at the restaurant, had known everything, because the leak wasn't just in the facility's communication chain. The leak was closer than that. Closer to him than he had understood in the North office when he'd been calculating the geography of what had gone wrong. Someone who knew about Amara had told the network. Someone in his own operation. Naomi had made a sound, a single, short sound, that he realized belatedly he had said the child's name aloud, had said Amara, and he turned to look at her and her face had done the thing faces do when the worst version of the fear they've been carrying crystallizes into a specific shape. And it was worse than the fear because fear has some room in it for the thing not to have happened yet. "Tell me," she said. He did not look away from her. "They took her," he said. "She's not hurt. They left a phone, which means they want a conversation, which means she's leverage, and leverage has to stay intact." He said it the way he said difficult things, directly, without the softening that other people used and that he'd always understood was a kindness to the speaker rather than the listener. "I'm going to get her back." Naomi Johnson's face went through something that was beyond the vocabulary of expressions he'd cataloged in 41 years of watching people under pressure. It was the face of a woman who had just learned that surviving the worst thing had not been the last worst thing, and that the next worst thing had her daughter in it. She didn't scream. She didn't fall apart. She put her hand on the back of the seat in front of her, flat, pressing down, and she breathed through her nose 3 times, and she said in a voice that was entirely flat and entirely controlled, "Who took her?" "The same organization that held you. They knew she came to you." "Yes." "How?" He looked at her. "I don't know yet," he said. That was true. He didn't know yet. He had a list of names on a drive and a clean phone sitting on a table in his restaurant, and somewhere in the chain between the moment Amara had walked out of the dark and held out 7001 and this moment in a moving vehicle, someone had made a call that had put her in this. The clean phone on the table was a message. It was a message that said, "We know what you took. We know what you found. Give us back the drive and the girl goes home." He hadn't heard the message yet, but he knew what it said, because it was the only message that made sense, and the people who had constructed this entire situation, the facility, the clean team, the restaurant breach, the taken child, were people who understood leverage and documentation and the precise application of pressure to a specific point, and the specific point they had just applied pressure to was not his organization or his reputation or his financial interests. It was a 7-year-old girl who had trusted him. He thought about that. He thought about the wrinkled bills in his breast pocket. They were still there. He hadn't moved them since the moment he'd taken them in the street outside the restaurant, and he was conscious of their weight now in a way he hadn't been during the operation. And he thought about the kitchen girl who had lined up Amara's sneakers on the floor, and he thought about the face Amara had made when she'd asked, "You're going to help?" with that careful voice, like she didn't want to put too much weight on it. He had put her in this, not directly, not intentionally, but he had taken her money and put her in his restaurant and gone to Incheon and left her there, and the people who wanted to hurt him had found the most precise instrument available and used it without hesitation. The vehicle was still moving north. Naomi's hand was still flat on the back of the seat. Sung-ho had not said anything since passing the phone. Taejin dialed Chae-won again. "The clean phone," he said. "Don't touch it. I'll be there in 35 minutes. He paused. "And Chae-won, Start finding out who knew the girl was in that building. How far back do you want me to go? Taejin thought about everyone who had been present in the restaurant from the moment Amara had stepped out of the shadow between the car and the wall. Everyone who had seen her face and heard her name and watched him take her money and put her in the back office. The kitchen staff. The security at the door. The men in the convoy. Sung-ho. Sung-ho, who was sitting in the front seat right now and who had been present for every single moment. He did not look at the back of Sung-ho's head. He said, all the way back to the beginning. And he hung up. And the convoy moved through the dark with Naomi's silence filling the back seat like something with weight and temperature. And the drive back to Seoul was the longest 35 minutes Taejin had spent in years. And when the city lights finally rose out of the flat dark of the highway, it felt not like arriving somewhere safe, but like entering the place where the real confrontation was going to happen. The restaurant in Cheongdam-dong looked wrong from the outside. Not dramatically wrong, no shattered glass, no visible damage, no sign that anything had occurred beyond the ordinary closed at 4 a.m. stillness of a high-end establishment after hours. But Taejin had been coming to this building for 9 years, and he knew its particular nighttime quality the way you know the sound of your own house settling, and what he saw when the convoy pulled up was the absence of two specific things: the light in the second-floor corridor window that his overnight security always kept on, and the shadow of a man at the corner of the building that should have been there. Both were gone. He was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. Chaewon met him at the door, a compact man, 40, with a broken nose that had healed slightly off-center, and the particular economy of movement that came from spending 20 years in situations where unnecessary motion was a liability. He had the look of someone who had been managing a disaster for the last 40 minutes, and had run out of the particular adrenaline that made disaster management feel like action rather than damage control. How many of mine are down? Taejin said. 2 in the building, 1 critical, 1 stable. The kitchen girl took a blow to the head. She's at Severance. They say she'll be okay. Chaewon's voice was tight. They were in and out in under 4 minutes. Professional entry, no wasted movement. They knew the layout. They knew the layout, Taejin repeated. Every room, where the security positions were, where the cameras were, which corridor to take. They didn't sweep. They walked straight to the back office. Chaewon met his eyes. Taejin, someone gave them a map. Taejin moved past him into the restaurant. The main dining room was untouched. Tables still set for tomorrow's service. The particular careful elegance of the place preserved perfectly, which made the wrongness of the back corridor feel sharper by contrast. The overturned chair outside the office, the dark stain on the floor beside it that he stepped around without looking at directly, the back office door standing open. The clean phone was on the table. It was a basic model, the kind sold in convenience stores, screen side up. Beside it, on the floor, were Amara's sneakers, still lined up neatly side by side, exactly as whoever had placed them had left them. The sneakers had not been moved. That was a message too. It said, "We were here. We saw everything. We left these because we wanted you to see that we took her without them. That she went in her socks small and fast, and there was nothing anyone could do." Taejin picked up the clean phone. 1 contact in the address book, no name, just a number. He called it. It rang twice. "You move fast," the voice said. Male, Korean, the accent placing him somewhere in the Gyeonggi region, the voice itself carrying the particular smoothness of someone who had learned to keep their affect controlled, because controlled affect was a power tool. "We heard about Incheon. 11 women. Impressive." "Where is she?" Taejin said. "Safe. Unhappy, but safe. She's a determined child. She tried to bite one of my men. I respect that, actually." "Where?" "We want the drive, the photographs, everything your man took from Han's office before we could clean it properly." A pause. "We know you have it. We know it's on a drive in your lieutenant's jacket. You give us the drive and the photographs, everything, and the girl goes home. And if I give you the drive and the photographs," Taejin said, "and then you disappear back into whatever structure you're running out of, and 6 months from now there are 11 more women in a facility outside some other port city." A silence that was itself a kind of answer. "That's not your concern," the voice said. "Who are you?" Taejin said. "Someone who has been operational in this region for 4 years without drawing attention from the Black Tiger Syndicate, which tells you something about what we're capable of. Someone who, until tonight, had no particular interest in you or your organization." We're extending you a courtesy, Kang Tai-jin. Give us the material, and this ends. The girl goes home. Her mother goes home. Everyone returns to their regular lives. And what happened to Naomi Johnson, to the other 10 women? That just continues. That's not your concern, Tae-jin said. Yes, you said. He ended the call. He stood in the middle of the back office with the clean phone in his hand and the sneakers on the floor and the weight of the crumpled bills still in his breast pocket. And he stood there for 15 seconds doing something he rarely did in operational situations, which was nothing. Just standing, letting the full shape of it assemble itself in his mind without trying to manage it into something more comfortable. Then he turned around. Sung-ho was in the doorway. But they looked at each other across the width of the office. Tae-jin had known Sung-ho for 19 years, had worked beside him through things that had forged the specific alloy of trust that only comes from surviving situations where the person next to you could have chosen differently and didn't. He knew the sound of Sung-ho's footsteps. He knew the 3-second silence and what each variation of it meant. He knew the geometry of Sung-ho's stillness, how it looked when he was thinking versus when he was managing something versus when he was genuinely calm. What he was looking at now was none of those things. What he was looking at was a man standing in a doorway who had not moved to enter the room. How long? Tae-jin said. Sung-ho's face did not change. That was, in its way, an answer. How long? Tae-jin said again. 8 months, Sung-ho said. The words came out with the flatness of a man who had been carrying a thing for so long that when it finally came out, there was no drama left in it. It was just the thing, stated, sitting in the air between them. 8 months. Tae-jin held that number in his mind and measured everything against it. 8 months of syndicate operations, 8 months of convoy routes and facility locations and personnel deployments, 8 months of every conversation that had happened within range of Sung-ho, which was to say nearly every conversation that mattered. They have something of yours, Tae-jin said. It wasn't a question. Sung-ho was quiet for a moment. Then, my son. They took my son 8 months ago. 19 years old, he was working a freight job at Incheon Port. They took him inside of a week, and they told me he stopped. They told me what they'd do to him if I stopped cooperating. Tae-jin looked at him. I didn't know what they were, Sung-ho said, and his voice had the particular texture of a man who was not asking for absolution but who needed the record to be accurate. In the beginning, I thought they were a rival organization trying to get intelligence. By the time I understood what they were actually doing, I was already... He stopped again, looked at his hands. I was already in it. My son was already in it. You told them about the girl, Tae-jin said. I told them a child had come to the restaurant. I didn't... Sung-ho's voice fractured for the first time. Just slightly. Just once. I didn't know they would take her. I thought they would use the information to move the women before you could reach the facility. I didn't know they would... But they did, Tae-jin said. Yes. The silence between them had a particular density, 19 years of weight pressing on both sides of it. Where is your son? Tae-jin said. Sung-ho looked up. They have a secondary location, Sung-ho said slowly, not the Incheon facility. Something smaller, private. I was never given the address directly, but I know the contact who manages it. The same contact I've been reporting to for 8 months. His jaw tightened. I know his number. I know his pattern. He checks in with me every 3rd day. The last check-in was yesterday, which means the next one is the day after tomorrow. Which means if you want to find him, I need him now, Tae-jin said. Not the day after tomorrow. Then I call him, Sung-ho said. I tell him you agreed to the exchange. I tell him to set a location for the handoff. He'll want somewhere neutral. He'll choose the location himself. He always does. It'll be somewhere he's already assessed. He met Tae-jin's eyes. And when we show up, we don't hand over the drive. Tae-jin looked at him for a long time. Your son, he said. He's at the secondary location. I believe so. Based on what I know about their operation, how they move assets when a primary facility is compromised. Yes, I believe he was moved there when the Incheon operation went active tonight. He could be used as leverage at the handoff. Yes. They could put him in the room. Yes. Sung-ho's voice was steady now, with the steadiness of a man who had already traveled to the far end of every terrible possibility and come back. I know that. I've been living with that for 8 months, but they already have the girl. They already have the leverage. The drive is the only thing we have. If you make the exchange, you lose the drive and they disappear, and the only thing that changes is that the girl goes home. He paused. If we don't make the exchange, we find the location before the handoff, Taejin said. We go in before the handoff happens. That's what I'm saying. And if your son is there, then we get him out too. Taejin was quiet. He looked at the sneakers on the floor. He looked at the man in the doorway, the man he had trusted with 19 years of operational knowledge, who had betrayed that trust under a pressure that Taejin, standing here now, could not say with certainty he would have survived differently. He thought about a 19-year-old boy at a freight dock who had been taken inside a week and used as a lever against his father for 8 months. And he thought about a 7-year-old girl in her socks somewhere in Seoul, and he thought about the drive in Sung-ho's jacket, with the names of the people who had built the machine that had swallowed all of them. Call your contact, he said. Set the exchange. 3 hours from now, you tell him. Somewhere in the Port District lab. Let him pick. Let him think he has the geography. The moment you have a location, you give it to Jae-won. Sung-ho nodded. And Sung-ho? He looked up. After this is done, Taejin said, we have a different conversation. About what comes next for you and me. Understand? Yes, Sung-ho said. I understand. Naomi Johnson had been placed in the restaurant's private dining room on the ground floor, a room with no windows and one door that Jae-won had secured from the outside with 2 men, not to imprison her, but because the 2 men outside were the safest thing available in a building that had been breached an hour ago. She had been given water and a phone charger that fit her model and a blanket that she had not used. When Taejin came in, she was sitting at the table with her hands flat on the surface, her eyes going to him immediately with the question she didn't have to say aloud. She's alive, he said. They want the documentation we took from Incheon. They'll exchange her for it. You're not going to give it to them, Naomi said. It was not a question either. No. Because if you give it to them, it goes away, and they go away. And what happened to you and the other 10 women keeps happening to other women. Yes. She breathed in slowly. So what do you do instead? We find out where they're holding her before the exchange happens. We go in. And if you can't find it in time? He didn't answer that. She looked at him with the exhaustion of someone who had been awake for more than 60 hours, and the sharpness of someone who was not going to let exhaustion do the work that clarity should do. She went to you because she thought you were the only person powerful enough to do what needed doing. She was 7 years old and she made that decision, and she was right. Don't make her wrong. I won't, he said. He believed it. He also knew that belief was not the same as guarantee, and Naomi knew he knew it, and they sat with that for a moment. The other women, Naomi said. Where are they? Medical team is with them. We have a facility, not the restaurant, somewhere else, somewhere clean. They're being taken care of. Are they safe? Tonight they're safe. She nodded. She looked at her hands. Tell me what you need from me. Nothing right now. Stay here. Stay with the men outside the door. Don't tell me to just wait, she said. I'm not telling you to just wait. I'm telling you that right now the most important thing you can do is stay in this room and let me work, and in 2 hours I will come back to this room and I will tell you where your daughter is. That's what I'm telling you. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she nodded. Sung-ho made the call from the kitchen. Taejin listened from the doorway, not because he didn't trust Sung-ho to make it correctly. The conversation they'd had in the back office had resolved something, and what it had resolved, specifically, was the question of whether Sung-ho was going to try to manage 2 directions at once, and the answer that conversation had produced was no, not anymore, but because he needed to hear the contact's voice. The contact picked up on the second ring. The conversation was short. Sung-ho told him Taejin had agreed to the exchange. The contact asked about the scope of materials. Sung-ho described the drive and the photographs accurately. The contact asked for 3 hours. Sung-ho confirmed. The contact gave a location. The container yard on the south side of Incheon Port. Pier 7, midnight. Pier 7. Back to Incheon, back to the Port District, to the geography they already knew, to a location the contact had presumably assessed as defensible and controllable. It was a confident choice. It said the contact believed he had the leverage and the positional advantage, and that Taejin would come as a man making an exchange rather than a man running an operation. That confidence was the mistake. Taejin was already at the table with the Port District maps when Sung-ho ended the call, and Jae-won was beside him, and he had 2 hours and 17 minutes. He started working. The secondary location, where Amara and Sung-ho's son were most likely held, Had to be within 20 minutes of Pier 7. That was operational logic. You kept your leverage close to your exchange point so you could produce it or move it quickly depending on how the exchange went. 20-minute radius from Pier 7 in the Incheon Port District was a specific geography, and within that geography there were a limited number of structures that could hold people without attracting attention, the same profile as the Incheon warehouse, more or less, but smaller and more private. Byun-cheol knew the port district. Tae-jin called him. I need every private structure within 20 minutes of Pier 7 that's been leased or sold in the last 2 years to any corporate entity without an obvious operational reason to be in the port district, he said. I need it in 45 minutes. Byun-cheol said, "That's a lot of 45 minutes," Tae-jin said. He hung up and looked at the map and thought about Amara in her socks somewhere in the dark, with the broken zippered coat probably still around her shoulders because whoever had taken her would have taken her fast and not thought about her coat. And he thought about whether she was scared. He knew the answer. She was scared. She had been scared every moment since her mother hadn't come home, and she'd moved through the fear with a stubborn, furious momentum that had brought her to his doorstep and then here. She was scared and she was in the dark and she was waiting. He was not going to make her wait longer than he had to. Byun-cheol called back in 38 minutes. 3 candidates. A fish processing plant on the eastern edge of the district. Operational but running night shifts, too much foot traffic. A private warehouse in the north sector registered to a shell company incorporated in Singapore 14 months ago. And a converted residential structure, originally a foreman's house from the old Port Authority, sold 18 months ago to an entity registered in Macau, sitting on a service road 1 kilometer from the container yards, backing up to the water. The residential structure. Tae-jin put his finger on it. The fish processing plant had workers. The warehouse in the north sector was too close to the main freight road, too visible for something that needed to stay private. But a converted house on a service road by the water, registered through Macau, to an entity that connected to the same offshore structure as K&S Trading, sitting close enough to Pier 7 that the drive from there to the exchange point was 8 minutes. He looked at Chae-won. "I need 8 men," he said. "The best 8. Not for the exchange, for the house." Chae-won's eyes went to the map. He traced the distance between the house and Pier 7. "You're running 2 operations simultaneously." "Yes." "The exchange team at Pier 7 draws the contact's attention. The other team hits the house during the exchange window." "Yes." "If the timing is off, the timing won't be off." Chae-won looked at him. He had the expression of a man who wanted to argue and had enough experience to know that arguing with Tae-jin's operational decisions in the planning phase was a different category of futile than arguing with anyone else's. "Okay," he said. 8 men. "I'm leading the house team," Tae-jin said. "You should be at the exchange." The exchange is a performance. Sung-ho runs the performance. He's the one they're expecting to manage the handoff. "I'm not needed there." He looked at the map. "I'm needed at the house." Chae-won was quiet. "She hired me," Tae-jin said. "Not the organization. Me." That ended the discussion. At 11 p.m., the convoy split. 7 men with Sung-ho toward Pier 7, carrying the drive. A real drive, the one from Sung-ho's jacket, because Tae-jin had transferred the photographs to 3 separate secure locations, and the drive itself was now both bait and proof of good faith. If the exchange happened before the house team finished, Sung-ho would stall. He knew how. He'd been managing conversations with people who wanted more than he could give for 8 months. 8 men with Tae-jin toward the service road by the water. The night had gotten colder. The sky over Incheon Port was low and gray with cloud cover that killed the stars and gave everything the flat, shadowless quality of spaces lit from within the clouds themselves. And the water to the east was invisible, just a sound, a presence, the smell of brine and cold metal. The house sat at the end of the service road as the map had shown it, low and square, with lights in 2 windows and a vehicle parked beside it, a single-panel van, dark, which told Tae-jin that the holding force was small. They had not reinforced for what they considered a routine leverage situation. Good. Tae-jin crouched at the end of the service road with the 8 men behind him and looked at the house and listened. From inside, faintly, through the window with the light, voices. 2 distinct voices. Male. Korean. He held up 2 fingers. The team adjusted. He was thinking about the layout. A converted residential structure meant rooms, interior doors, a floor plan that was more compartmentalized than a warehouse, and therefore required more careful movement. He didn't have Byung-cheol's layout intelligence this time. He had the external footprint of the building and the position of the lights and the two voices and 8 men. He thought about Amara. He thought about the way she'd held the money out with both arms extended, shaking with the effort of it, not letting them drop. He stood up. He moved toward the house. The first man through the door was Ryu, the same Ryu who had opened the Incheon warehouse lock in 11 seconds, and who moved through doorways with a quality of absolute commitment that Tae-jin had always found useful and occasionally alarming. The door was not locked, which was its own piece of information. They hadn't expected anyone to find this address, which meant the confidence of the people running this operation was real and structural rather than performative. Inside, a short entrance hallway, a main room with a table and 2 men who stood up fast, too fast, knocking the table, reaching for weapons that were on the table rather than on their persons, which was the particular complacency of people who had been sitting in a quiet house for 3 hours watching a clock. They didn't reach the table. Tae-jin moved through the main room toward the hallway on the far side and the closed door at the end of it, with the particular momentum of a man who has nothing left to weigh against his objective, and the door was locked, and he did not wait for Ryu. He hit it with his shoulder once, and it held, and he hit it again, and it gave, and he went through it into a small room with a bare bulb overhead, and a cot against the far wall, and 2 people on the cot, sitting up fast at the sound of the door coming in. A young man, 19, maybe 20, with Sung-ho's cheekbones and Sung-ho's eyes and 3 days of stubble, and the specific wariness of someone who had stopped expecting good news from the sound of doors opening. And beside him, her back against the wall, her feet in white socks, her broken zippered coat still on and safety pinned at the throat, her 2 sleep-roughed braids, and her enormous dark eyes, and her jaw set with the iron quality that was entirely her own and entirely her mother's. Amara. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I told you I kept my promise," he said. Her jaw held for exactly 1 more second, and then it didn't. She didn't cry. She made a sound that was not crying and not crying, but something in between, something that had the quality of a very long breath finally released. And she crossed the 3 meters between them in 4 steps, and she hit him somewhere around the midsection with the full force of a 7-year-old who had been holding the worst fear of her life for 4 days and had just put it down, and he caught her. And he stood there in the bare bulb light of the small room with this child's fists twisted in his charcoal jacket and her face pressed somewhere below his ribs, and he put 1 hand on the back of her head. Ryu was in the doorway. The young man on the cot, Sung-ho's son, was watching with an expression that had traveled very rapidly from shock to something it was going to take several years and a lot of distance to name properly. Tae-jin's phone buzzed. It was Chae-won's number. He answered it with 1 hand, the other still on the back of Amara's head. "Sung-ho is at the exchange point," Chae-won said. "The contact showed. 3 men with him. Sung-ho has the drive and they're—" A pause. "Tae-jin, the contact just identified himself. It's not just the local operator. He brought someone senior with him, someone on the list from Han's office." Tae-jin's hand stayed on the back of Amara's head for exactly 2 more seconds. Then he set her back gently, both hands on her shoulders, and looked at her face. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was coming back, that iron quality reasserting itself even now, even here, which told him everything he needed to know about who she was going to be when she was grown. "Stay with him," he said, nodding toward Sung-ho's son. "Don't move from this room until I come back." "You're coming back," she said. Not a question, a condition. "Yes," he said. He straightened up and looked at Ryu. "Stay with them. Nobody in or out." Then he was moving. He was back in the vehicle before Hae-won finished the sentence, the phone pressed to his ear, the engine already running because the driver had read the quality of his exit from the house and understood without being told. "Who?" Tae-jin said. "The name is Lim Byung-chul," Jae-won said. "He's listed as a senior logistics coordinator in the network documentation. But the way Sung-ho's contact deferred to him when he walked up, this isn't logistics. This is operational command for the Korea network. He's the one who makes the calls. He's the one who sent the clean team to Incheon. He's the one who ordered the restaurant." Tae-jin processed this without speaking. Lim Byung-chul. The name had been on the list, 3rd from the top, with a set of financial connections that ran deeper and wider than any of the other names. The kind of financial footprint that indicated someone who had been doing this long enough to build infrastructure rather than just operating within someone else's. He had looked at that name in the North Office at Incheon and understood that it was important. He had not known it would be standing at Pier 7 in the middle of the night holding Sung Ho's exchange like a personal audit. He came himself, Tae-jin said. Yes. Why would he come himself? A pause, then Jae-won said slowly, like he was assembling something as he said it, because he wants to know who you are. He knows the Black Tiger Syndicate hit his facility and extracted his documentation and removed his clean team. He knows your name. He came to look at you. Tae-jin thought about that for the 4 seconds it took to think about it fully. A man who had been building an international trafficking operation for 4 years, who had survived by being careful and invisible and by eliminating problems before they became problems, had come to a midnight exchange point in person because he wanted to assess the man who had just become his largest problem. That was either profound confidence or profound miscalculation. And in Tae-jin's experience, those two things were frequently the same. How many men does he have total at the pier, Tae-jin said. 6 that we can see. Sung Ho's contact plus 5 others. Sung Ho has 7. Sung Ho knows he's there? Sung Ho is looking at him right now. I have a man with a line of sight. Sung Ho's face when Lim walked up was... Jae-won paused. He held it together, but just. Tae-jin thought about what it meant for Sung Ho to be standing 20 feet from the man who had used his son as a lever for 8 months. He thought about what 19 years of training and discipline looked like when it was being asked to hold against something that personal, and he thought about whether it would hold long enough. Tell Sung Ho to stand down, he said. Do not engage. I'll be there in 8 minutes. 8 minutes is a long time for Sung Ho right now. Tell him 8 minutes, Tae-jin said. Tell him his son is out. Pier 7 at midnight looked the way industrial port locations look in the dead hours, vast and flat and indifferently lit by the overhead sodium lamps that turned everything the color of old bone. The container stacks rose on 3 sides, corridors of steel 40 feet high, creating a natural enclosure that whoever had chosen this location had chosen deliberately. You could see one approach from 50 meters. You could not see around the corners of the containers. Tae-jin's vehicle came in without headlights, moving along the service road that ran behind the easternmost container stack and stopped 30 meters from where the exchange was happening. Through the gap between 2 container units, he could see the group. Sung Ho standing with 2 of his men, the drive in his hand. Sung Ho's contact, a lean man in a dark jacket, mid-40s, with the particular stillness of someone running a performance, standing with 4 men. And to the contact's right, slightly apart, with the positioning of a man who does not consider himself part of the group, but above it. Lim Byung-chul. He was shorter than Tae-jin had expected. 50-something, trim, in a coat that had been expensive once and had seen enough use that the expense was no longer the first thing it communicated. He was watching Sung Ho with the focused, assessing attention of someone conducting an evaluation, and the thing that struck Tae-jin immediately, watching him through the container gap, was how still he was. Not the operational stillness of a trained man holding his body in check. Something older than that. The stillness of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything and had found a kind of terrible peace in that. Tae-jin moved through the container gap. He came out of the dark on the edge of the sodium light, and Sung Ho saw him first. A fractional shift in Sung Ho's eyes, quickly controlled, and then the contact saw him, and then Lim Byung-chul turned. They looked at each other across 20 feet of pier concrete. Kang Tae-jin, Lim said. You came yourself, Tae-jin said. Tae-jin, I wanted to. Lim's voice was even and unhurried, and had the quality of a man who had decided in advance how this conversation was going to go. I've been in this region for 4 years. I've been careful, I don't make mistakes. And then one night a man I've never had any reason to concern myself with drives to Incheon and takes 11 women out of my facility and walks away with 8 years of documentation. He tilted his head slightly. I wanted to see you. And you're what I expected, Lim said. A capable man running a local operation with a local code. You protect your territory. You have rules about who can be touched. You're respected because you enforce those rules consistently. He paused. I made the mistake of operating inside your territory without accounting for those rules. I won't make that mistake again. No, Tae-jin said. You won't. Something moved in Lim's eyes. A recalibration. He had come here to conduct an assessment and close a transaction, and the transaction had developed a quality he hadn't built into his model of it. "The girl is out," Tejan said. "My people have your secondary location. Whatever leverage you thought you had coming into this conversation, you should adjust that number." A silence. The contact beside Lim shifted his weight. One of the 5 men moved fractionally and stopped when one of Sung Ho's men moved fractionally in response. And the whole group held itself in the specific suspended tension of people who are all very aware that a single non-deliberate movement could change the nature of the evening catastrophically. Lim looked at Tae-jin steadily. "What do you want?" he said. "I want you to understand something," Tae-jin said. "I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not law enforcement. I'm not going to hand you to someone who will put you in a room and ask you questions for 6 months and build a case." He took 2 steps forward, closing the distance to 15 feet, and kept his voice at the same level. Conversational, unhurried, with the flatness that meant everything underneath it. "I have 8 years of documentation of what you've built. I have names, financial structures, transit routes, client records. I have enough to dismantle what you've spent 4 years constructing in this region, and I have enough to follow every thread on that list until the people above you and beside you understand that continuing to operate anywhere near my territory is a decision that ends badly." "You're going to use the documentation," Lim said, carefully. "I already have," Tae-jin said. 3 hours ago, I transmitted everything on that drive to 2 journalists and 1 international law enforcement contact I've been careful never to need before tonight. The copies exist now, regardless of what happens to the drive, or to me." He watched Lim's face. "The drive you came here to recover doesn't change anything anymore." The stillness Lim had come in with was still there, but something behind it had changed. A structural thing. The way a wall looks the same from the outside after the thing supporting it from the inside has given way. "You planned that before you came here," Lim said. "While you were sending men to my restaurant," Tae-jin said, "I was making phone calls." A long silence. The sodium lights hummed. The water was somewhere close in the dark, moving against the pier supports with a sound like slow breathing. Lim looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at the contact beside him. Then he looked back at Tae-jin. "The girl and my man at the secondary location," he said. "Your man is in custody. He stays there until I've confirmed the network in this region is shut down. The girl goes home tonight." Tae-jin held his eyes. "You have a choice now. You can try to manage this, disappear, rebuild elsewhere, hope that what I've already transmitted doesn't reach the right people before you reconstruct. Or you can understand that the version of your operation that exists as of tonight is over, and make whatever decisions follow from that." "Those aren't the same choice," Lim said. "No," Tae-jin said. "They aren't." Another silence. Then Lim Byung-chul did something unexpected. He almost smiled. Not warmly, not with any real warmth available to it, but with the specific expression of a man who had lived long enough doing what he did to recognize when a situation had genuinely gotten away from him, and who had enough self-possession left to find something almost like respect in that recognition. "A child hired you," he said. "Yes." 7,001. "Yes." He looked at Tae-jin for a moment longer. Then he turned to his contact and said something quiet, and the contact nodded, and Lim walked away from the exchange point toward the far end of the pier into the dark between the container stacks, and his 5 men followed, and the night took them. Tae-jin stood where he was until he could no longer hear footsteps. Then he turned to Sung Ho. They stood 2 feet apart in the sodium light with the sound of the water and the distant hum of port machinery filling the space between them, and Sung Ho looked like a man who had been carrying something for 8 months, and had just put it down and was not yet sure what his body was going to do without the weight. "Your son is out," Tae-jin said. "He's in the house on the service road. Ryu has him." Sung Ho's eyes closed for exactly 2 seconds. "Thank you," he said. "Don't," Tae-jin said. Not harshly, just directly. "Don't thank me yet." Sung Ho opened his eyes. "You told them about the girl," Tae-jin said. "You told them she was in the restaurant. 2 of my men are in the hospital because of the information you gave that organization, and a 7-year-old child spent a night in a locked room in her socks, and you did that." "Yes," Sung Ho said. "I understand why," Tae-jin said. "I want you to know that I understand why. If someone had my daughter—" He stopped. "Let that sit." I understand why. That doesn't change what it was. No, Sung-ho said. It doesn't. You're done with the syndicate, Taejin said. Not violently. You go. You take your son. You go somewhere, and you build something that doesn't have any of this in it, and you don't come back into my operation. That's what this costs. Sung-ho nodded. The nod had the quality of a man accepting something he had already accepted months ago, in the part of his mind where decisions get made before they get spoken. 19 years, Sung-ho said. Not as a protest, as a statement of what was ending. 19 years, Taejin said. They stood there for another moment. Then Sung-ho put out his hand. Taejin looked at it. He took it. They shook hands once, the grip lasting exactly as long as it needed to, and then Sung-ho turned and walked toward the vehicles, and Taejin stood alone at the exchange point in the sodium light, with the water breathing against the pier below him and the sky above still that low, starless gray. Teets. He drove back to the house on the service road. Amara was sitting on the cot when he came in, Sung-ho's son beside her, and she was talking, actually talking, in the low, steady way of someone filling silence because silence had been the enemy for 4 days, telling him something about her school and a teacher she didn't like. And the young man was listening with the slightly dazed quality of someone who had been through enough in the last 8 months that a 7-year-old narrating her academic grievances was both absurd and profoundly grounding. She looked up when Taejin came through the door. My mom, she said. She's waiting for you, he said. She's been waiting since we got her out of Incheon. Amar stood up. Then she stopped. Looked at him. Is it over? She said. He thought about Lim walking into the dark between the containers. He thought about the documentation already transmitted, the threads that would keep pulling regardless of where Lim went. He thought about 11 women in a safe location with medical care, and about the network in this region that would not reassemble itself with its leadership compromised and its documentation in circulation. He thought about what over meant in a world where these things existed and would keep existing. And he thought about what it was possible to honestly tell a 7-year-old who deserved honesty more than comfort. This part is over, he said. Your mom is safe. You're safe. The people who took her can't touch either of you again. She held his eyes with those enormous, dark eyes. Okay, she said. She said it the way she said everything, with the weight of someone deciding to believe something rather than just accepting it, making it a choice. Okay. She picked up her sneakers from where Ryu had placed them by the door. Quote. He drove her back to Seoul himself. It was close to 3 in the morning and the highway was empty, and Amara sat in the back seat and fell asleep somewhere around the halfway point. Not the nervous sleep avoidance she'd been doing for 4 days, but actual sleep, the deep, involuntary kind. Her head tipping sideways against the window with the complete muscular surrender of a child who has run out of adrenaline and let go. Taejin watched the road. He thought about the last 24 hours in the way that he rarely allowed himself to think about operations while they were still warm. Usually he put distance between himself and the texture of something before he examined it, let it cool into fact before he looked at it. But there was too much in this one to defer. The women. 11 of them from 6 countries, held in a freight warehouse because they had been identified as people without strong enough connections to make their disappearance costly. Naomi Johnson among them, separated in her own locked room because she had spent 3 days looking for a way out instead of waiting for one. Han Gyu-seok, who was not going to answer any more questions. Sung-ho, somewhere behind him now, driving toward a son who was alive because Taejin had moved fast enough, and driving away from 19 years because the thing he had done in the middle of those 19 years had a cost that had to be paid by someone. Lim Byung-chul walking into the dark at Pier 7, carrying the knowledge that the documentation existed and was already beyond his reach, and that the version of himself that had operated invisibly in this region for 4 years was finished. And Amara asleep in the back seat with her sneakers on and her broken zippered coat still safety pinned at the throat. He had taken 7,001 and made a promise, and the promise had expanded in the making of it into something much larger than either of them had understood when she held the money out. He had gone to Incheon and found what he found and sent the documentation to the people who could use it, and the using of it was going to take time, months, maybe years, working through the financial structures and the transit routes and the client records. But it was out now. It was in motion, and the motion was irreversible. He had not planned for any of this. He had planned for a local rescue operation, fast, clean, contained. He had driven to Incheon to get one woman back for her daughter. What he had found instead was the full architecture of something that had been operating inside his territory for 18 months without his knowledge, and the finding of it had cost him his closest lieutenant and 2 hospitalized men and a kitchen girl who was going to have headaches for weeks, and it had also put 11 women back into the world who would otherwise not be there. He didn't know how to weigh that arithmetic. He never had been good at that kind of arithmetic. But the restaurant in Cheongdam-dong was lit when they arrived. Not the subdued overnight lighting, but the full interior, the kitchen staff and 2 of his security team who had stayed through the night, and when Tae-jin came through the black lacquered door with Amara half awake and walking in that stumbling automatic way of deeply tired children, the kitchen staff stopped what they were doing. The private dining room door opened. Naomi Johnson came out. She had been awake the whole time. That was obvious from the quality of her eyes. The way she was carrying herself with the careful uprightness of someone who had refused to lie down because lying down meant accepting the possibility that she was waiting for news rather than a person. She stopped in the hallway when she saw Amara. Amara stopped being half awake. She crossed the distance between them in a way that involved both running and not quite running, the urgent, full-bodied movement of a child who has been far from her mother for 4 days and has just covered the last 10 feet. And Naomi caught her and went down to her knees on the restaurant hallway floor and wrapped both arms completely around her daughter and held on. Tae-jin stood in the doorway and watched. His kitchen staff watched. His 2 security men watched. Everyone in that hallway watched, because some things have a quality of completeness that makes them worth witnessing. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are real in a way that most things in a given day are not. And realness of that density is rare enough that you stand still in the presence of it. Naomi was not crying. She was making a sound that was not crying, lower than that, more involuntary, the sound a person makes when the worst scenario they have been holding at arm's length for 4 days collapses and the space it occupied fills with something else. Amara was talking into her mother's shoulder, muffled, rapid, the debriefing of a child who needed to tell someone everything immediately. Tae-jin could not hear the words. He looked away. He looked at the floor of his own restaurant and at the dark stain by the overturned chair that someone had tried to clean and not entirely succeeded, and he thought about the kitchen girl in the hospital with her head injury, and about the 2 men who had gone down when the breach team came through, and he thought about how all of it connected back to a child standing in the cold with crumpled money and the uncomplicated belief that power, correctly applied, could be a form of justice. She had not been wrong. That was the thing he kept arriving at. She had been 7 years old and frightened out of her mind, and she had made a calculation that most adults would not have made. And the calculation had been correct. Not because he had never claimed to be just and did not start now, but because she had understood something true about him that he had not fully understood about himself. That beneath the empire and the reputation and the 19 years of carefully constructed authority, there was a line that could be crossed. That the line existed. The children were on the protected side of it absolutely, and that a man who had let that line erode would lose something he couldn't reconstruct. She had known that. She had bet everything on it, and she had been right. He gave them the large private dining room for what remained of the night. A bed was brought in, a real one, not a cot, and blankets, and food that Amara ate seriously and completely before falling asleep again, within 20 minutes of the meal, tucked against her mother's side with her coat finally off, and her sneakers finally off, and her braids finally coming loose, and Naomi sitting upright beside her in the way of a woman who was not going to sleep for a long time, but was not going to move either. Tae-jin came to the door at 5 in the morning. Naomi looked up. "There are things we need to talk about," he said quietly. "Not tonight, but soon." "The documentation you sent," she said. "Yes. And what comes after it? There are people in the network above Lim Byung-chul who are going to want to understand what happened here. Some of them are going to look at you and Amara as part of the story." He held her eyes. "I'm going to make sure they can't reach you. That's going to require some changes to how you're living here, at least for a period." Naomi looked at her sleeping daughter for a moment. "She starts school again on Monday," she said. "She's been working on a project about the Han River. She was upset because she thought she was going to miss the deadline." Tae-jin looked at her. "She doesn't miss her deadline," Naomi said. "Not as a question." "She doesn't miss her deadline," he said. Naomi nodded. She looked back at Amara and then back at him with an expression that had several things in it simultaneously: exhaustion, assessment, and the particular quality of someone arriving at a conclusion they hadn't expected to arrive at. What you did tonight, she said. The women. The documentation. You didn't do that for me. I did it because it was there to be done, he said. That's not the same as doing it because it's right. No, he said. It isn't. She held his gaze. Is it the same as doing it because it's right? She asked. He thought about that for a moment with the full weight it deserved. Thought about the women in the facility. The 11 who had nothing to do with Amara or with him, who had simply been in the building when he arrived and whose freedom had been an extension of an operation that had started from a child's trust and a crumpled $5 equivalent. Thought about whether what he had done was justice or operational success or something he didn't have a word for yet. I don't know, he said, but I'm going to find out. She looked at him for another moment, then she said, Thank you, Kang Tae-jin. And the way she said it was different from the way she'd said it in the Incheon facility. Not grateful, or not only grateful, but something more level and more permanent. The acknowledgement of a debt that both of them understood could never actually be repaid, and therefore had to exist as something other than a debt. He nodded once and closed the door quietly. Outside, the sky over Seoul was beginning to change. Not light yet. 4:50 in the morning in late October was still full dark. But the quality of the darkness was different. The particular shift that happens in the hour before dawn, when the night begins its retreat and the air gets its coldest, and the city, which never fully sleeps, becomes briefly quieter than it is at any other hour. He stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant with the black lacquered door behind him, and the stone facade in the two spots where his men would normally be standing, which were empty now because the men were inside or in the hospital or somewhere else. And he stood there in the cold and breathed. The ginkgo trees on the main boulevard 2 blocks over were still. The leaves that had been tearing loose in the wind earlier had settled, or there were no leaves left to tear loose, just the bare structure of the branches visible now against the slightly lighter sky above the city. He put his hand in his breast pocket. The money was still there. The crumpled 5001 note and the two 1001 notes, folded once, exactly as he'd folded them when he took them from Amara's shaking hands. He took them out and looked at them in the dim light from the street lamp. 7,001. He thought about what the next months were going to look like. The documentation moving through the channels he'd sent it to, the financial structures being traced, the transit routes being dismantled thread by thread. He thought about rebuilding the security at the restaurant and finding someone he trusted to stand where Sung-ho had stood. And he thought about whether that kind of trust was something that could be found again, or whether it had to be built over time the way all the things worth having were built. He thought about the list of names and the work it was going to take to follow each one. He thought about Amara sleeping in his private dining room with her school project deadline intact and her mother's arm around her. He put the money back in his pocket. He went back inside. Months later, on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, a small envelope arrived at the restaurant. No return address. The handwriting on the front was a child's handwriting, deliberate, slightly uneven. The letters formed with the focused effort of someone still learning to make them consistently. Inside was a folded piece of paper, and on the paper was a drawing done in colored pencil. Two figures, a tall one and a small one, holding hands. Above them, taking up most of the upper half of the paper in bright yellow and orange, a sunrise with rays extending outward in all directions. Below the drawing in the same careful handwriting, you kept your promise. Thank you for being the right kind of powerful. Tae-jin sat at his desk in the back office for a long time with the drawing in his hands. Then he stood up and took it to the wall above his desk. The wall where there was nothing, where he had never put anything, where the stone was bare and clean, and he found a nail and hung it there. He stood back and looked at it. The colored pencil sunrise glowed against the gray stone wall with an intensity that had nothing to do with the quality of the materials and everything to do with who had made it and what it had cost her to be the kind of person who could make it. Every year after that, on the anniversary of that October night, a fresh envelope arrived at the restaurant. Always the same amount, 7,001, tucked inside a note that said, "For the next child who needs help." Tae-jin used the money each time exactly as instructed. He kept a record of every child it had gone toward, in a small ledger in his desk drawer, names and outcomes. And the ledger grew slowly but steadily over the years into something that had the quality of a different kind of empire entirely. The feared Korean Mafia boss, who had once been known only for what he took from the world, had found, in the 20-odd steps between his car door and a child's outstretched hands, the one thing that all his power had never built. He had found what it felt like to be enough.